Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Sam Koslowski.
Yesterday, Spotify released its annual Wrapped feature for 2025. Now, this is a yearly tradition I'm sure much of our audience is familiar with, where millions of users get to see their most listened to songs and artists for the year, among plenty of other interesting stats. But alongside these personalised data drops, Spotify also releases stats telling us about national listening trends. And there's been a lot of discussion about one thing this year: the absence of Australian artists from the top of those lists. Today, we are going to explore why this is the case and what we've learned from Spotify Wrapped 2025.
And what an interesting topic for us to dive into on a Friday. It's got a bit of tech to it. It's got a lot of culture and music, and it really is centered around our national identity. As a music institution, why don't we start with Spotify Wrapped as an idea and as a product? If you aren't engaged with it, give us a sense of what happens on Spotify Wrapped Day.
Yeah, so just in case you were living under a rock or you weren't on social media yesterday, usually around early December every year, Spotify releases what it calls Wrapped, which is basically a summary of its users' listening habits over the past year. So users at an individual level get to see their top artists, top songs, podcasts, how many minutes they've listened to music, what percentile they're in at the kind of top end of fandom for their favorite artists, a bunch of really interesting stats.
Just quickly, who was your top artist this year?
Gang of Youths, of course.
Okay, very cool. Mine was Sam Fender. Both quite similar in their musicality.
Similar vibes.
We should hang out.
And I've got to say, Spotify has gotten really good at packaging this data up. So it releases it in the form of very shareable infographics. They look really cool, and it's become this huge social media moment. Millions of people post their Wrapped results to their Instagram stories. That is how Spotify has designed it. And for a bit of context, in terms of scale, we're talking about 281 million paid subscribers who are with Spotify globally, and that includes some 13 million Aussie listeners.
So about half of Australia went through a Spotify Wrapped moment yesterday. We got the results. A new feature even showed us how old the platform thinks we are based on our listening habits.
Yep, that was a good one.
I'm 27, which I was quite flattered with as a 30-year-old. It was awesome.
My life flashed before my eyes when I read that I'm 70.
Okay, righty.
Yeah, not good.
I'll turn up the font size on this script. What were some of the big takeaways, though, in terms of the music?
Yeah, so the top artists streamed by Australian listeners this year were Taylor Swift, followed by Drake, Morgan Wallen, The Weeknd, and Billie Eilish. In terms of songs, the number one tracks for Aussie listeners were Ordinary by Alex Warren, followed by That's So True by Gracie Abrams, Birds of a Feather by Billie Eilish, Back to Friends by Somber, and Bruno Mars, who rounded out the top 5 for his track with Rosé.
So if you look at the artists that have topped both that song list but also the general artists list, am I wrong in saying that they're all American?
Well, technically they're all North American, but you're not wrong. It's a mix of US and Canadian artists that dominate both those lists. They don't include any Aussie performers. I guess there might be a bit of a loophole with Rosé, the K-pop singer. She was born in New Zealand, moved to Australia when she was 8 before moving to Korea as a teenager to pursue her K-pop career. So I don't know, maybe there's a loophole there, but otherwise, yep, all North American artists.
Clearly the list is dominated by the biggest names in global music. I want to talk a little bit more about what that means and what we can read into that. Before we get there though, what Aussie artists did we listen to this year?
So along with these lists of most listened to artists and songs overall, Spotify also crunched the numbers when it comes to our top local artists. The Wiggles came in at number 1. Now, I think you can imagine probably a lot of parents out there streaming a lot of Wiggles against their will, but congrats to the Wiggles. The list also included The Kid Laroi, AC/DC, Hilltop Hoods, and Tame Impala. Interestingly, the top local song for 2025 was Riptide by Vance Joy.
Which is more than 10 years old, right?
Yeah, it came out in 2013. In fact, when you look more closely at the top local songs list, none of them are actually new releases from 2025.
Right.
That trend is also reflected in the most listened to local albums of the year as well, with 2 records from the 80s making it into the top 5. We had Back in Black from Akadaka and Kick from In Excess.
It's quite a striking set of data because clearly, when it comes to new music, Aussie listeners seem to be favouring international tracks. If they do return to their local music roots, it's in more of a nostalgic sense, right? Like it's either for children's entertainment, trying to make the kids be quiet in the back of the car, or it's a throwback to their childhood in the 80s, or a more recent episode of high school back in 2013.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly how things seem from the Spotify data. We'll get a little bit more into the kind of critical analysis around that, but it's not as though this trend has taken us fully by surprise, Sam.
Right.
You will know that the Daily Aus actually worked with Creative Australia earlier this year to look into listening behaviours of Aussie fans, and the findings from that were really interesting. Only 8% of the 10,000 top streamed artists in Australia were homegrown.
Right.
That's despite 33% of respondents saying they actively seek out Australian music.
So let me throw that back to you. So 1 in 3 said they're looking for Aussie music, but only 8% of the 10,000 most streamed artists are Aussie.
Yep.
Did that research suggest why that could be the case?
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
Well, Creative Australia looked into discoverability. This is a really important part of the conversation. And according to its report, 98% of Aussies discover music through streaming platforms. 66% find it through social media. But the report found that discovery tends to skew heavily towards international artists. Now, that's what we're seeing reflected in the Spotify numbers.
And when you say discovery in a Spotify sense, or any of the streaming apps really, what we mean by that are things like new songs of the week, or things that come across your homepage. They might be in a fresh finds playlist.
Yeah.
That's what you mean by discovery, right?
Absolutely. And these algorithms put together personalised playlists that are updated regularly.
So the DJ and all that kind of stuff.
And they learn from your listening patterns and, ultimately it's the platforms that decide which music to prioritize in those playlists. Now, one of the key findings from Creative Australia was that there is limited visibility of local artists, and that is affecting discovery. Young people said they want to discover more Aussie music, but they just aren't sure where to find it. In fact, 66% said they want to discover more Aussie music, and 42% said they would even pay for a streaming platform dedicated to Australian music. So the interest is there, but they don't know where to find it.
So the demand for Aussie music clearly is shining through some of that data. People can't seem to find it. Are young people less interested in music overall? And did we kind of get a sense from these stats of if we're listening to as much music as ever?
The research shows us that young people are really still interested in music. They really care about it, and they're willing to spend money on music they enjoy. They're paying to see live gigs, even with economic pressures. They're prioritizing spending money on live music experiences. So it's not that they're disengaged from music, but there does seem to be a disconnect between live music patterns and Australian streaming patterns.
And we know that the kind of live music bit is a bit downstream. Like you discover the artist first, you begin to be obsessed with them.
Exactly.
Then you go and buy a concert ticket and a t-shirt. How have local artists responded to these discoverability concerns, particularly in light of yesterday's data?
Yeah, it's no new story that many musicians have these long-standing complaints about how Spotify and other similar platforms pay their artists. There are concerns over discoverability algorithms, and so this data has really reignited that conversation. It's ongoing, but we know some Aussie artists have actually been leaving Spotify or deciding not to release any new music through the platform, and this is a really important part of the context. So King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, one of Australia's most successful exports, actually removed their entire catalogue from Spotify a few months ago. That was in protest of the Spotify CEO and co-founder, who's been criticised over his investments in a defence company that manufactures AI military technology. Australian musician David Bridie also left the platform around the same time for a combination of the reasons that I've touched on. Bridie wrote about his decision in The Guardian and said that basically Spotify pays artists less than 1 cent per stream, which he called, quote, insulting and completely unsustainable. Bridie wrote, this leads to a situation where only the independently wealthy can create music, assuming they're able to fight off the AI-generated music currently crowding onto the streaming platforms. He continued, quote, the removal of my works won't make any significant dent in the company's profits. It won't change my earnings much either, but I can no longer be complicit. So a combination of factors there that he touched on.
So a big day for Spotify. They obviously get a lot of social media attention with everyone sharing their Wrapped findings of the year, but they've had to answer some hard questions as well. How did the company respond to these really tricky questions around local music and the listener behavior of Australian users?
Yeah, we did get a statement from Ben Watts. He's Spotify's head of music for the Australia-New Zealand region, and he acknowledged that global artists have an enormous reach in all markets, really. But he told TDA that this year we have seen a healthy mix of both homegrown and international music. He said local audiences are connecting with that music and it's, quote, achieving remarkable momentum of its own. Watts continued to TDA that, quote, Spotify recognises that it has a key role to play in supporting Australia's music ecosystem. In 2024 alone, we paid over $300 million to Australian rights holders, with more than half going to independent artists and labels. Watts said Australian music is also travelling further than ever, and their global data shows that open platforms like Spotify, quote, create opportunities for local music to be discovered across the globe.
I think this leaves the Australian music industry in a really interesting spot because it's clear that the core pillars of what makes a music industry great and what makes an artist great have changed, as with so many other industries, particularly by technology. What's your view on where things kind of stand for Aussie music going forward?
We have this really complicated context. You know, we've shifted away from radio plays and physical record sales as a means to measure the success of artists. We have so much connectedness with the world, and, you know, we can listen to artists from any country really in the palm of our hand within seconds. There are some really positive stories to be told, though, and I think it's important to reflect on that.
Yeah.
Australian dance music, for example, has seen huge growth. Streams have increased by more than 409 million compared to last year, according to Spotify. And I mean, look at Rufus Du Sol, a Sam Koslowski special. The Aussie trio recently set a new record for the most tickets sold by an artist or group for an electronic live tour after 750,000 people attended their shows this year, 750,000. They're one of 3 Aussie acts nominated for a Grammy at next year's ceremony, along with Amel and the Sniffers and Tame Impala, of course. So we know local talent is punching above its weight on the world stage. It's just whether or not new talent can emerge. So I think we're going to see this conversation continue. Discoverability conversations are certainly not going anywhere. We know young people want to find and support Aussie artists. They just need better pathways to do that.
And that was a fantastic discussion. And I think that if you want more of this, I think everyone should probably subscribe to your TDA Culture newsletter.
Oh, thank you, Sam.
It's a really good read because it takes us a little bit further than usual on some of these cultural stories. And I think it's a great example of this chat because you've got Spotify Wrapped out there in the world yesterday. It would have been on everybody's social feeds. I love that you've taken us one layer deeper. So thank you for that chat.
A pleasure, Sam. Thanks for sharing it with me.
And thank you for joining us on the Daily Aus this week. It's been a massive week of news here with interviews and streaming discussions. We've got a whole big week of news coming up for you next week as well. Until then, we'll be back with the headlines in the afternoon and chat to you later.